Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Hello and welcome to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio with me, Megan Cornwell. This is the show where we delve into a person's life, faith and ministry, and it's brought to you in association with the UK's leading Christian magazine, Premier Christianity. If you'd like a free sample copy, go to premierchristianity.com/free sample. Today I'm speaking with Natalie Collins, a gender justice specialist who writes and speaks on the issue of domestic abuse. She's just released her first book, Out of Control, Couples, Conflict and the Capacity for Change. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you.
So tell me a bit about your faith. Did you grow up a Christian?
Yeah, so I grew up in the north of England, as my accent may betray. And I grew up in a Christian home. My parents got together and hadn't come from Christian homes and discovered the Christian faith together. And so they'd become were conservative, but very kind of a faith which was very much about relying on God. So I remember growing up and us praying about needing money and money just appearing from somewhere. And, my mum would have this purse for tithing, and church was really important part of my growing up. I remember one time we couldn't go to church and I insisted we did church at home, and we had a Vitalite tub for the collection, and so I was kind of my faith and growing up in and this was a very significant part of my understanding of myself and the world was Christianity.
And you're a gender justice specialist.
Yes.
What on earth is that?
Well, I made the title up because I do so many different things, and I was trying to work out one thing I could put it into. A friend of mine said, when I saw that signature, I thought I'd really like to be one of those. How do you become one? I was like, well, I just sort of made it up. But I started off delivering programs for women in the community who'd been subjected to abuse by a partner. And then from there, I started to work with Christians on the issue of abuse. Then I wrote a program for young people called the Day Program, which is about abuse and exploitation and is really about trying to be preventative. So I train practitioners across the UK to run that program. I wrote a Christian version of that program, which looks at theology with young people. I then started working on things around pornography and masculinity and child sexual exploitation and, all the fun topics, female genital mutilation. Nobody wants to sit next to me at a dinner party. What do you do? And so I was doing all these different things. And then I was doing quite a lot of media work and being asked, what should we call you? Because there was a nice title. So I used the term gender justice specialist to try and capture that all of the stuff I do is to do with the idea of inequality. And as a Christian, I think that equality is a term that feels quite optional, and actually can feel quite counter theological ideas of what it is to be kind of somebody who follows Jesus and giving up power and all that kind of stuff. And so I think justice is something that is a gospel imperative. And so for me, I feel like gender justice specialist sums up all the stuff I do and the values with which I do it.
What do you see currently as the barriers to full equality between the sexes in church? In church particularly,
I think it's very difficult to isolate the equality issues and the issues for women in the church from the wider society. So we don't live, some people might think that the church is a bubble separate to the world, but actually we are embedded within a culture. And so we can't separate issues of sexualization and objectification of women from the experiences that women have in the church. Things around purity culture and this idea that women should wear certain clothes or be a certain way. So I think it's complicated to say what is the issue in church. I think it's very multifaceted. I think if we start with a baby girl, or even before that, if we look at the issues in terms of women being forced into pregnancy, is the first step in terms of that being an issue. And then when a baby girl is born, the way that she will be related to will be different than a baby boy. Then those expectations grow. And in church, we very much adhere to, for the most part, gender stereotypes around raising boys and girls. So that will come into play. And then as they get into being young people, the expectations are that boys are all going to be very interested in sex and girls aren't really going to be interested in sex. And so that then plays a part. As those boys and girls get into young adulthood, the ones that are going to be tracked into leadership roles will often be male. That girls will have to really push if that's something they feel called to. They might be in a church context where women don't have any roles that are visible on the platform or that kind of stuff, and so they haven't really got any way of thinking that's even something they want to do. Or they might be in a church where women can have leadership roles but not in the church, so they can be a GP or they can be a politician, but they're not allowed to do that within the church. And so there's all sorts of things. So I don't think there's just one thing. There's theological ideas that say that men and women have different roles, and that's a God-ordained scriptural thing. So I think that comes into play. So in terms of the theological roles that men and women have, well, I would hold to what is known as an egalitarian position. So this idea that we are called according to the gifts that we have, not according to our male or femaleness, is not really relevant in terms of how God calls us. However, there are the other position generally is the complementarian position, which would say actually there's a very clear scriptural ideal that men and women have different roles and are called to different things because of those roles. So I would hold the egalitarian position, and so would seek to see both men and women leading together in partnership.
Would you look to the Bible as sort of evidence for that position, in the same way that the complementarians would say, well, these are the scriptures that sort of support our argument?
Yeah, so I think my entry into being very committed to egalitarianism was actually not through theology, or it was through having an understanding of male violence and that there is an issue with men abusing women that is much more significant than the amount of women that are abusing men. And so it was actually not through kind of a theological conversation, but this realization that when women don't have positions of leadership in the church, that contributes to a perception of women and men having very different roles, and those different roles can perpetuate ideals of men having to be in charge of women, which can lead to domination over women. But yeah, absolutely, I would argue that theologically, the Bible has, I mean, it's one of those things where everybody can take the Bible and say, the Bible says that women shouldn't be able to do these things, or the Bible says that they should be able to do these things. So I think it just depends on which text you focus on. I would suggest that in Genesis, pre the fall, there's very little indication of different roles for men and women. Somebody who's complementarian would say there is. And then I would say things like when God creates Eve, that he creates a helper suitable for her is one of the texts. And actually, I would argue that the word helper there is used most often of God, so it doesn't suggest some sort of subservient role. And that actually the term suitable, when you look at the original language, is this idea of standing face to face with. So actually, equal partner would be as useful a translation. And so then when you get into the New Testament, people will focus on Ephesians and say, well, it says wives submit to your husbands. I would be more interested in the fact that comes in the context of submitting to one another in love. But equally, you get somebody here who would hold a different theological position, and they could quite articulately argue why I'm wrong. And so to some degree, I think as much as I am convicted that the Bible does have the position of egalitarianism, I also believe this because my experience of God has been that God is entirely liberating to women, and that liberation does not mean placing any limits or restrictions on how women can serve God.
But in terms of male headship, do you see any difference between headship as a concept in church and headship as a concept in the family, or would you reject both of those?
I think that both are actually fundamentally quite harmful. I don't think everybody who practices male headship is harming either themselves or a partner. I'm not saying it in a kind of that way, but I think that this idea that men hold some greater responsibility than women for anything is really problematic. I've spoken to some complementarians, and they say said, when we strip it back, what is it that you really believe? And they said, when I get to heaven, I'm going to be more responsible for my wife's sin than she is. And I was like, that's not something that I see in scripture. So that was somebody saying that that's how they see it. So I think what's really problematic about male headship is that it ends up with a load of theological kind of stuff that's not even what most theologians who are complementarian would actually adhere to, but it kind of gets caught up in stuff that people pick up. So I think headship is I don't think it's a very helpful thing, and I don't think it enables mutual flourishing. I think it puts unhealthy, unnecessary responsibility on men to do stuff that I don't think enables them to flourish, and I think it limits women in ways that I don't think enables women to flourish either.
And Natalie, you set up an organisation called Project 328, which monitors the number of women at Christian festivals who are given a platform. Have you seen any improvement in female representation since you started the project in 2014?
Yes, we have. So which has been really great. So in 2014, after some new stuff that happened in the States with Rachel Held Evans, who was one of the people who kind of inspired this really, there was a journalist, Jonathan Merritt, who he counted one set of events in America. And we were just like, there was a woman called Helen Austin in the UK who said, where's that in the UK? And I was like, right, I'll get on counting. And so, I mean, it's become a project, but basically what it is a group of us who spend our time counting how many men and women on programmes around the UK. And thankfully, events like Spring Harvest are now really brilliant in collecting that data themselves. And that's really shows that level of commitment has really grown. And so we've seen the platform increase from 25% women in 2014, and we're now up to 38% women. And it's really something about events, I think, to some degree, there was no accountability. If there was one woman and 10 men on a platform, you'd go, oh, well, this event is pro-women because there's a woman. And so when we did the stats the first time, people were like, this isn't surprising. We all know it's not great. But for some people, they were like, I can't believe it's that bad. So we've seen this increase, and it's a gradual, for the most part, it is this gradual year-on-year incremental change. And for us, it's not about people making big gestures of, oh, we'll get like loads and loads of women. It's about creating a culture which says we recognise that there are particular barriers for women gaining opportunities, and so we're going to work very methodically to overcome those barriers and to enable women to lead too.
We know that women who speak out on feminist issues tend to get quite a lot of abuse on social media and that sort of thing. Has that been the case for yourself?
It has its challenges. I think most of the time it's fine, and I sort of have a rule around positive intentions. I assume even when somebody's being negative or disagreeing with me that they don't hate me, and that this isn't like, that there's abuse. It's actually that they just have a very different perspective. And I think a lot of the problems we have in the church is this idea that the people we disagree with hate us or don't want human flourishing. Generally in the church, we all want human flourishing. We just have very different ideas of how you get there. And so there's something about the honouring of positive intentions that hopefully opens a different sort of space. But yeah, I mean, mostly not from Christians. Occasionally I get stuff from Christians telling me I should be ashamed to be a Christian, and, being very, very negative. But on one occasion I didn't realise this guy that I'd replied to on Twitter was a really well-known comedian who was slightly misogynistic, who shared my tweets with his followers, and it led to days and days of just this onslaught of abuse towards me. And I think it's one of those things that's really interesting that I've had debates online with Christian men who don't, have argued with me, and then they'll use things like, oh, I've been abused or I've been badly treated, when actually what they've experienced is someone disagreeing with them. And there's this kind of double standard that just because somebody's disagreed with them, that's abusive. And what they haven't had is like people sending them graphic sexual images or calling them horrific names, or that kind of stuff, which has been part of what I've experienced, but I wouldn't say is the majority.
And as a feminist and a Christian, do you find it difficult to articulate your position on certain issues? So I'm thinking of abortion in terms of, that's kind of seen as traditionally feminists would see it as a pro-choice issue, and Christians see it as a pro-life issue. Do you find any tensions being a feminist Christian on those kinds of ethical issues?
Yeah, I think one of the clear things is Christianity and feminism are not the same thing. I don't think Jesus was a feminist. Jesus was like a first century Jewish man, and there's already a debate about whether men can actually be feminists. So I think we have to be careful about co-opting Jesus into our narrative. And if Jesus was a feminist, that means any Christian who doesn't say they're a feminist, how do they get to be a follower of Jesus? And so I think it's really problematic for us to we can't call Jesus a socialist, a feminist, or whatever it is that we want, or a capitalist, or, a complementarian. That Jesus was who was the savior of the world. And so it's more complicated than that. And I think probably the biggest challenge I find as the dichotomy between feminism and Christianity is that Christianity requires us to die to ourselves. It requires us to be willing to sacrifice ourselves. And feminism is all about women taking ownership of themselves and saying, I should have rights. I should be kind of being treated equally. I should fight against the awful things that are going on for women, either for myself or for my sisters. And so that, I think, probably over all the other things, fundamentally, that's where the biggest challenge comes, is this idea that how do I hold together this idea of, as a Christian, I should be dying to myself, but as a feminist, I should be fighting for my rights. And I think that, that can come into the abortion debate. But I think for me, part of that is because so, for instance, one of the challenges within the feminist movement is we've never really had a figure like Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. We haven't had a figure who has kind of preached love as the solution to the revolution, really. And part of that's because whereas for within the civil rights struggle, the way that Black people were dehumanized was to make them not fully human. And what Martin Luther King said was, well, if we love, we are more human. And so love was the antidote to this dehumanization that happened through slavery and racism, and still does happen. However, within the feminist movement, the challenge is that one of the ways that women is oppressed by having to be giving and compassionate and empathic and being a mother and giving themselves all the time. And so it's almost one of the tools of women's oppression is being compassionate and loving. And so how do you then say, but compassion and love are the solution, when for lots of women, they're one of the ways that we are really, really damaged and really expected to lay down and ask, which way do you want me to walk over me today? And so I think there is a real tension. And I personally have kind of come to the way of processing that and coming out the other side by believing that actually the problem for Christianity is that it hasn't always recognized the ways that women are uniquely oppressed and challenged, and the way that sin particularly hurts women. And so before we as women can before we can give ourselves up, we have to learn to own ourselves. We have to learn to take ownership of ourselves and say, actually, God doesn't require me to be a doormat. God actually thinks I'm really awesome, and God has chosen to love me. And we have to be willing to own ourselves before we can die to ourselves. And so that's one of the ways that I think feminism has been a really important part of me gaining ownership of myself, so that then I can choose to die to myself. And I guess I see that the feminist heart for justice and listening to women and hearing women is something that we often don't see in the church as much as we could do with seeing.
Yeah. And bringing it back to that issue of abortion, when you're talking about love and compassion, would you apply that to love and compassion for the woman who's desperate to not be pregnant? Or do you apply that idea to the child who would probably like to live? How do you kind of make those distinctions?
Well, this is the question, isn't it? And I think the reason why abortion is so complicated is because you've got, because God created us to be interconnected, that we don't exist independently of each other, that the woman the only way we can make a baby is for a man and a woman to create that baby. And the only way that baby can live is if the woman carries it inside her. And so we're not disconnected human beings, but it also means that sin affects us in ways that are really, really horrific. And so, for instance, rape and sexual violence can lead to somebody becoming pregnant. And so suddenly it becomes a much more complicated conversation. And I think there's a Mormon blogger who talks about the fact that all abortions are the fault of irresponsible ejaculation. That actually women can only get pregnant a few days every month, and actually that if men choose not to use condoms because it's slightly less pleasurable, even though the implications for women of them not using a condom, them not taking responsibility, can be so huge for women. And so I think that makes this issue hugely complex, because the way that the focus of this is always on what women should be doing and not really on what men should be doing. And so, this Mormon blogger on the extreme was like, we should give all men a vasectomy. And when they're ready to have children, they can have it reversed, and that's it. And I know scientifically it's not quite that simple, but actually it's really interesting how what we find is so much of the time these conversations and laws around abortion are really about controlling what women can do. Very rarely are conversations about unwanted pregnancy, about how men can stop impregnating women when they don't want to be pregnant. And in the UK, 1 in 7 women has been subjected to reproductive coercion, either forced into pregnancy or forced into abortion. And so I think it's a very complex one, and we have these very simple kind of answers. Well, is the priority the baby being born, or is the priority the woman, kind of having her choice? One of the things I would say is I don't think anybody enters into abortion lightly. And I think absolutely there are people who choose abortion and they would say it's not affected them in any way, and that actually that was their choice. And as somebody who was pregnant at 17 in a very complex situation and didn't really have a choice about being pregnant, the consequences of the choice that I chose to continue that pregnancy, as much as I love my daughter and would not have made another choice, I'm in the position of somebody who could be, that advocate going, well, my child's here and this is how it should be. But actually, having gone through, my daughter's now 16, having gone through 16 years of very complex stuff around that, I wouldn't be able to force anybody into that. So I think the thing about abortion being a legal means is that somebody doesn't have a choice to keep a baby or to remain pregnant. I think that's really problematic. So when a few years ago I was involved in a project about young motherhood, and The Guardian had run something about this project. It was about women who'd had children as teenagers, and it said something on the Guardian headline about why we're glad we chose to be teenage mothers. And I remember looking at it and thinking, I need to ring up the editor. I didn't choose this. This wasn't something that I made a choice to do. This was something that I was subjected to as a result of abuse. And then actually it dawned on me that because I chose to keep my child, because I chose not to have an abortion, I did make a choice. And that was really profound and revelatory to me. Wow, I wasn't just a victim of this situation. I made a choice in this situation where I had some power and I chose to do that. But the idea that I would be in a world where, or anybody would be in my situation, be in a world where that choice was taken away from them, particularly in a world that doesn't take maternal health as seriously as it should, that doesn't do the things it should do, I think that's a very, very dangerous thing to think about. And I think, when we talk about being pro-life, what does that mean? Does that mean that we are campaigning for things like, in the UK, we've got the tax credit rape clause, which means that if a woman has more than 2 children, she doesn't get tax credits for her 3rd child or her 4th child. And so the only way she can get tax credits is if she's been raped and if she's been impregnated against her will. Now that will have a bigger impact on how many women choose to have abortion than the fact that abortion exists. If you can't afford to feed your children, and I have not seen any of the pro-life charities in the UK campaigning for an end to that brutal and horrific policy of the 2-child tax credit policy. And so for me, fundamentally, I think that when we talk about being pro-life, unless that involves proactively doing lots of things, campaigning against unjust policies, it's problematic to use the term pro-life unless you're doing all of that.
That brings us to the end of part 1 of today's show. But join us again to hear more from Natalie Collins right after this.
A prayer movement is building. Thousands of people are praying for peace on our streets. So join us in prayer and be a shining light for the young people caught up in crime. See the crime in your area by entering your postcode and pray strategically for your neighbourhood, young people, their families and communities. Let's pray that God will intervene in this time of darkness. Enter your postcode on the prayer map at peaceonourstreets.org.uk.
Have you ever bought an investment sold by Barclays, Halifax, Lloyds, Santander or any other bank or financial advisor? Investments like stocks and shares ISAs, investment bonds and certain types of pension can be risky. If you lost money with one of these investments, you could be owed thousands of pounds in compensation. Even if you no longer have the investment or the paperwork, here at Goodwin Barrett we can still help. To start your free assessment with Goodwin Barrett, text QUICK to 66777. That's QUICK to 66777.
Premier enables the hope of the gospel to reach our nation every day. Premier's strong voice of hope is needed now more than ever. It's the time for the Christian voice to be heard, the time for Christians to respond to our calling, the time to shine light across the UK. Right now is the time to support Premier in the Save a Life, Give Hope summer campaign. Please help Premier continue broadcasting throughout the summer. Your gift of any amount is needed now. Call 08000 74 77 77.
Is your driveway, patio or garden looking tired? Cracked paving, uneven paths, overgrown and embarrassing to look at? Wouldn't you like outside areas you could relax in and enjoy? Then you need Polar Home Improvements Limited. The complete driveway, patio and gardening specialists. Trustworthy, reliable, competitive, and all work is fully insured with a 10-year guarantee.
And flexible finance with no deposit and affordable monthly repayments. Call today on 01708 503 062. 01708 503 062 with special discounts for Premier listeners.
If you're serving God online, make sure you enter the Premier Digital Awards 2019. Are you reaching out, informing and inspiring others through your Christian website, blogs or digital campaigns? Enter one of the 17 categories now, from apps to blogs, podcasts to websites, and be in line to win one of our prestigious awards. All entries will go into the draw to win an all-day ticket to the Premier Digital Conference and Awards and a Kindle Fire. Visit premierdigital.info. Premier Digital Awards 2019. Inspire, equip, connect.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio with me, Megan Cornwell, Deputy Editor of Premier Christianity magazine. That's the monthly magazine that sponsors this show. If you would like a free sample copy of our latest issue, just go to premierchristianity.com/free sample. But for now, time to rejoin my interview with Natalie Collins. Let's listen in. You've recently published your first book.
I have.
So that is called Out of Control, Couples Conflict and the Capacity for Change. Natalie, what's it all about?
Well, it's for Christians, and it's accessible to non-Christians. So when I kind of go into the weird kind of Christian stuff, I'm like, don't worry, we'll get out of this bit in a minute. So it is accessible for non-Christians, but I wrote it having worked with Christians for almost a decade on issues around abuse and coming up again and again against the same challenges and the same problems around people not really understanding abuse. One of the big issues is that most of the time when somebody is dealing with a situation of abuse in their church or in their family, they misdiagnose it as a relationship issue. They say, they're just having a relationship issue. It's just a difficult situation, and let's get them some counselling. Let's send them on the marriage course. And actually, what's going on is somebody is being abusive. And so when you misdiagnose abuse as a relationship problem or as mental health issues or anger management problems, actually the way that you will respond will be really harmful and could really damage somebody. It could, at the worst, lead to somebody being killed, to somebody murdering their partner or their children. And so I really wanted to write a book that would equip Christians to respond in a much more effective way and to be able to diagnose the problem for what it is. So that's why it's called Couples Conflict and the Capacity for Change, to try and look at, well, is this just a regular conflict or is there something more going on? So it's written in I suppose, as an accessible way as possible. It's written it is a pretty miserable, dark topic, but as much as possible, we try to kind of, make it a bit less miserable and, think about eating cake at the bad bits. And so it's not just about what is abuse and why does somebody perpetrate abuse. It's also about how we recover, understanding sexual violence. How do we raise children to make good choices in relationships, and understanding some of the implications about what we understand about domestic abuse in terms of masculinity, and how as the church do we think about manhood and being a woman and all those kind of things.
And unfortunately, you've had sort of first-hand experience of abuse. You were in a marriage that was very abusive. Can you just tell us a little bit about that time in your life, and particularly how God used that to almost hone your vocation and your calling into what you do now?
Yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? There's this, sometimes Christians have sort of said to me, well, God let you go through that so that you could, so he could use you. I don't think God's that utilitarian. If God loves us, like a parent loves a child, actually God doesn't want us to go through terrible stuff. God doesn't put us through stuff, but God is so good that no matter how terrible something is, God finds a way to bring goodness from the terribleness, not that God plans it or ordains it. And so, when as we talked about, I grew up in a Christian home and I loved Jesus, and I got to be a teenager. And my understanding as a teenager and as a Christian was that the way that you be a Christian teenager is you don't have sex before marriage. That's the entirety of how you be countercultural. You just don't have sex, and because everyone else is having sex, then that's how you witness the gospel, that you will save the world through your virginity until you get married, obviously. And so basically this was my approach. I was like, I'm not going to have sex before marriage. And then I met a boy who was beautiful, and I just thought that he loved me from the moment that I met him. And he turned out to not actually be very safe. I thought he was a Christian. I'd met him through friends who said he'd recently become a Christian. And so I was like, that's it. He ticks the two boxes. He's a Christian and we're not going to have sex. There we are. Like, this is it. 100% sex education. I'm fine. And so I started this relationship, and within 12 days, he manipulated me into sleeping with him, because in Christian culture, we're taught not to have sex, but we're not taught anything about consent. And so when I was being pushed into doing things that I didn't want to do, I thought the reason I felt bad was because I was betraying Jesus. I didn't know it was because he was making me do things that I didn't want to do. It wasn't I was betraying Jesus. He was sexually abusing me. And so 12 days in, I'd slept with him, and then that was it. I thought, well, I've got to marry him now. That's the only solution, which is quite problematic, really. And it's not necessarily that anyone in church sat me down and said, the minute you have sex, that's it, you're married. But that's the conclusion that I came to from this cultural framework of purity. And so 12 days in, I'm then convinced I've got to marry him. It emerged quite quickly that he wasn't really a Christian. He became increasingly manipulative and controlling. He would cheat on me with lots of different girls, and I just kept on thinking, well, if I forgive him and love him enough, then that will save everything.
Was this after you were married?
No, so this was before I got married. So this was all before even marrying him. So I just thought, this is it. If I love him enough, forgive him enough, Jesus will save him, because that's how it works. And it didn't really work like that. It just meant that he continued to treat me really badly. He wouldn't use contraception. And so within 6 months, I was pregnant. And my parents were ragingly pro-life. And so the one thing I knew was that like abortion was bad. And so it was one of the only times that I stood up to him when I said, I won't have an abortion. And so then I'm pregnant.
So he wanted you to have an abortion?
Yeah, him and his family all wanted me to have an abortion. But when I wouldn't, the relationship continued. So I had my daughter when I was 18, and then we got married a few months later. And so then I'm married to him. And, people are like, well, why did you marry him? When you grow up in Christian culture and it says that marriage is kind of the thing. That's what you've got to do. You've got to get married. If you sleep with someone, you've got to marry him. And marriage, will save us or something, And if anybody's watching this and kind of identifies with that, Jesus did not die for anybody's marriage. He died for us. And so we've got to be really careful not to make marriage and our spouse an idol. And so anyway, so I ended up then married to him, and he, by the time we were both 19, he'd been convicted of sex offences against teenage girls. And I thought, well, if I just love him and forgive him, it'll all be okay, which also then meant not only was he abusing me, but because it was public knowledge that I was married to a sex offender, I once got punched in the face by a neighbour. So it was this horrific situation. And he made me think that I was worth nothing, that I was stupid, ugly and fat, and that everything that he did wrong was my fault. And that was about what often is known as gaslighting now, this idea of making somebody believe it's all their fault. And I just kept on thinking, but if I love him enough, then Jesus will save him and everything will be perfect. And it was awful. He was very sexually abusive. And I thought, well, as his wife, I have to submit to whatever he wants. I don't think I really even understood that sexual abuse could exist between two adults, be it from one adult to another adult in an adult relationship. I thought this was kind of an adult to child thing. And so, so I'm in my 18, 19, 20 I was absolutely decimated by this. On one occasion, I started taking an overdose and I was taking loads of tablets, and he locked myself in the bathroom, and he managed to get into the bathroom and he saw me taking these tablets, and he was on the phone at the time, and he just started saying to me, go on, take another one, take another one, take another one, and just like goading me into suicide. And thankfully I didn't die. And I was just absolutely devastated. But if you'd have asked me at that time, so you were being abused, I would have said, no, it's not abuse. Like, no, he's had a really difficult time. And, I wind him up, and it's just difficult stuff. I got referred to a women's aid service, a domestic abuse service, and they were like, oh, you could come in a refuge. And I was like, I don't need a refuge. It's not abusive. So I think there's a huge issue where even when we're being abused, we misdiagnose it as something that it's not. And unless we can admit to ourselves it is abuse, and that's a really hard journey, because if it's abuse, I have to do something. If it's abuse, then it's not just going to magically get better if I just pray enough or if I just do the right thing. Because if it's abuse, it's not me. It's actually him.
What about that moment when you ended up in hospital with your little baby who was born premature because of abuse?
So my ex-husband assaulted me, and my son was born premature. And people often are like, "Oh, I wouldn't have expected this to be your story. Oh, I didn't think it would be like you would be like this. I've been told that I'm too tall to be abused. I'm too young to be abused. I'm not shriveled up enough." And what's interesting is, people will watch this or hear this and they'll think, oh, well, she doesn't sound like one of those type of people who's abused. There is no such thing as that sort of person. Actually, the only thing that we have in common is that we had the misfortune of meeting an abuser. And so I didn't get some sort of strength from somewhere to get out. It wasn't like I suddenly thought, this is it. I'm a strong, courageous woman. I'm empowered and I'll leave. It was that my son was born premature, and me and my daughter, who was 2.5, ended up living in a hospital with him for about 5 months. He was only £2.6 when he was born. And so it was that circumstance of being forcibly removed from the same town that led me to start seeing this is this is his fault. The reason that my tiny baby is so tiny and is in this plastic box, and I've got this 2.5-year-old who keeps on doing observations on her baby dolls because this is what she thinks is normal, that I started to realise, oh my goodness, this is wrong. And I think for so many women, it doesn't matter what they do, what the abuser does to us. It's when they hurt somebody that we care about, that we love, that suddenly we realise this isn't okay. Because actually the abuser, all of their tactics are designed to strip us of our selfhood. They're designed to strip us of anything that gives us strength. And this is one of the things that I think Christians don't often understand, that actually if somebody is an abuser and they're in the church, they will be stripping their partner of the gospel that gives them strength. And the gospel will be stripped of any liberation, and it will be a weapon to beat their partner with. And so it's really important that we recognise that's what's going on and don't just think, oh, well, he's just struggling or whatever. This is an intentional, deliberate act, and it is getting in the way of somebody's relationship with God very seriously. And so, so I was living in this hospital. I did report him to the police. He was found not guilty in the end due to he convinced me into various contacts with him during the court case, which then led to him being found not guilty. And it was absolutely horrific. It was absolutely devastating. I was 21. I ended up being a single parent with a premature baby, a toddler, I ended up moving away from my hometown because I thought if I go back there, I'll end up back with him. So moved up to the north of England, and I think my faith really, I'd always known God and always loved God, but the time when I discovered who God was for myself was when Joshua, my son, was first in hospital. I felt God said to me, and it was the first time God had really spoken to me. I wasn't one of those people that God speaks to. And then God said to me, you need to stop praying for Joshua to live, and you need to pray for my will to be done. And if he lives or dies, you need to love me the same. And I just was like, what? This God who I'd lived my whole life wanting to love and, all that kind of stuff, suddenly wasn't even going to give me hope. He wasn't going to be like a magical fairy godmother who was going to magically make everything better. But actually there was something hugely liberating in choosing not to try to make it all better, and just accepting that actually I can't do this on my own. I've tried to do this. I've lived in a relationship with somebody who is so abusive, and actually now I'm being offered freedom from that. I'm being offered an opportunity to choose God, even if it means losing everything. And so living in that hospital, that's what I did. I said, I'm going to choose to love you regardless of what happens. And miraculously, Joshua did survive. He's now 13 and really awesome. And my daughter's now 16. And so it was like this huge journey. But from that point onwards, I've just tried to do what God said. I've just tried to be obedient to God, go where God tells me to, do what God tells me to. And in the process, I've discovered that this God that I grew up knowing a bit about and then met in that hospital is the source of all liberation and all transformation. But often that won't look necessarily how we expect it to.
Did you find that your relationship with God helped you to forgive your ex-husband presumably after some time? Were you able to get to that point of forgiveness? And was that through your relationship with God?
I think forgiveness is a complicated one. So forgiveness was a part of how my ex-husband continued to abuse me, because I thought I just have to keep forgetting what he's done. If I just wipe the slate clean, this kind of Psalm 51, it's interesting because that Psalm, when it talks about forgiveness, it talks about God's forgiveness of us. It doesn't necessarily suggest that we can wipe the slate clean of what someone else does, because we're always left with the consequences of someone's harm towards us. My son always has difficulties because of being premature. Like, I can't wipe the slate clean of that. I can't wipe the slate clean of the trauma that I'm left with, and the fact that both of my children were born in a context which meant that I did not get to just have a lovely pregnancy or a lovely, early years with them. It was all much more complicated than that. And so the idea that forgiveness is just this wiping clean, if someone chops off our legs, we can't ever get our legs back, even whatever else happens and whatever attitude we have towards them. And so I think there's something about the way that we understand forgiveness in the church that was really oppressive to me and was actually contributed and colluded with my ex-husband and with the abuse. And so the first thing I had to do in terms of forgiveness was give up on the forgiveness that I'd taken hold of and understood that I was supposed to do, and that forgiveness is not denial. And so I think this again is where feminism comes in and becomes an important resource. As for me as a Christian, was the first thing I needed to know was that it's okay to be angry. And I think a lot of women need to be told that it's okay to be angry, and that Jesus says we should count the cost before we do something. So before we forgive, we have to count the cost of what someone done to us. And that can take years. And it can take years because, not just because it can take years to actually understand the cost, but because a new cost might come up. Years later, we suddenly discover another way that person's hurt is still affecting us, or that still damages us, or means we've lost yet another thing. And so I think part of it is about us having to give up on the false forgiveness, this false kind of, Bonhoeffer talks about cheap grace. We have to give up on that stuff and reject it and say that there is a place for anger and for being really owning the hurt that someone has caused us. And actually, once we have gone through that process, of course, there is a space. And for me, I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean nullifying the consequences of somebody's behavior towards us. I learned that forgiveness is not about rolling over and saying, which way do you want to hurt me today? It actually makes us stronger. And so for me, forgiveness is about having a right attitude of heart. I think I say something in the book about, forgiveness is when you no longer want somebody to be castrated without anesthetic. That's a step forward. And I think for me I have totally forgiven my ex-husband, but he doesn't have any contact with my children. I would fight to ensure that doesn't happen because he's dangerous and not safe. And that's not about hating him. That's about being the reality. And, we've seen over and over again, both in the US and in the UK, where churches have brought abusers in. We have this idea of the redemption narrative, this idea that everybody can be redeemed. And it's a really wonderful thing. But what it means is that we don't really have an understanding of the consequences of sin. And we have a lot about how to deal with being the sinner. We don't really have much about how do we deal with being sinned against. And so I think for me, forgiveness has absolutely been about liberation, but so has rage, and so has lots of part of this journey to healing. But yeah, forgiveness means that I don't hate him. In fact, I just don't really think about it, but that I put things in place to keep me and my children safe.
And Natalie, you have remarried, haven't you?
Yes,
since then. How were you able to trust men again after what happened to you? Was that difficult for you?
Well, I didn't want to get married ever again, and I didn't really. I think, kind of. I would have been happy to stay single for the rest of my life. and it wasn't like I didn't hate men. I had a son, and I had. And I think actually, a lot of the time I get accused of being man-hating because of being a feminist or because of challenging some of the stuff that's out there. But we never ever talk about when men abuse women, when men murder women and rape women and hurt women in lots of ways. We never call that woman-hating. But when a woman has an opinion and doesn't pat a man before she gives it, she's seen as man-hating. And no, and so I think, if you think about all the ways that men hurt women, it is surprising that we actually can still coexist. The amount of care and love that women continue to pour out on this world and not kind of set themselves up in some sort of colony like the Wonder Woman film where they just have like a woman-only island. I just don't know, I think we should all be applauded for continuing to continue these relationships with men. But I never really had a problem with men overall, and I don't have a problem with men. I think what has happened over the years as I've become more aware of this stuff, and one of the really important parts of my healing was realizing that my ex-husband was not some monster that like was not part of society, that he was the logical conclusion of a society in which male entitlement and ownership of women has been part of our history for a very long time. You know, men did own women for much of human history. The Bible is full of men owning women. And so it has been really important to have a structural analysis that says this isn't just about me and him. This is about a system in which men benefit in some ways from living in a world where actually they can walk down the street at night and not think they're going to be raped, because they're not going to be raped. And you know, women are often not going to be raped, but they're taught that they are. And actually women are most likely to be sexually assaulted in their homes by somebody they know. So I think, I got married. I got married because God told me to marry the man who's now my husband. And my first response was, no, I am not marrying him ever. He's 13 years older than me. And so I was like, he is old. I was in my early 20s and I was just like, no, he's old. And then the more that I thought I wasn't going to marry him, the more that I just knew that this was what was going to happen. And it was almost like God was protecting me from having to deal with all the complicated stuff around like having, you know, wanting to marry someone and then thinking, oh, if I'm making a bad decision. And, you know, so eventually after about 18 months of not really wanting to have the conversation, in the end, I said to God, well, if it's really you telling me to marry him, you can also tell him to marry me, which he did, thankfully. So, so basically we got married. We've been married for going towards 12 years now. And I am, for the record, very happy to be married to him, and he is very, very wonderful. And actually, when we first got together, when we first got married, it was really, really important that some of the things that he did, like I remember one time he rang me and he said, I'm going to be late home from work. Is it okay if I go out with friends after work? And I was like, why are you ringing me? And he was like, well, those children are as much responsibility as yours as they are mine. And you might have made plans, and your plans are just as important as mine. And you know, I'm never going to presume you're just going to be available. And I was like, my mind is blown, because I just thought it was my job. And I think a lot of the time in the church, there's this presumption that nobody ever challenges the status quo. And so, he's sometimes the DJ can like, you created this monster. Because he gave me,
empowered you.
It said that things didn't have to be how I just thought things had to be. Yeah. And so that then, so he's been at home with the kids for the last, maybe 6 years, and does all the childcare and all the housework and all the shopping, which is amazing. But actually, you know, I don't want everybody kind of standing up and applauding him, because women have been doing this forever and they don't ever get any applause. And so I say, you know, he is wonderful, but we've got to be careful about not kind of having a double standard that puts him at a higher, you know, status than women who do the exact same thing.
And finally, Natalie, you seem to have an awful lot going on. You've just written your book, you're running your training consultancy business, and you're doing all sorts of things. What's next? Is it mainly kind of promoting the book, or what have you got set your sights on?
Oh, do you know what? I just
you're going on a holiday.
No, I think for me, I always want to be open to what God is calling me to do next. So I'm not very good at being strategic. Like, what's your long-term plan? Do whatever God tells me. So I've written a program for women who've been subjected to abuse called the Own My Life course, and it's about building literacy around trauma. So that course is being piloted around the UK at the minute in Darlington, Grimsby, Portsmouth and Kent, and then that's going to be rolled out across the UK. There'll be free training available. It's not a Christian program, but it uses, but it's about liberation. I also am doing a master's at the minute. So that's in theology, and my dissertation is going to be around trauma and theology. And then I'm hoping to potentially go on to do further academic study as well, but who knows? And I think just generally, I think we're in a bit of a shake-up in terms of Christian culture, that the Me Too movement, sadly, It wasn't until kind of the wider culture started to wake up to this stuff. You know, God will raise the prophets wherever the prophets will listen. And sadly, they weren't often in the church. And so the church is starting to wake up to this stuff, which is really exciting and really positive. I think what we have to be really careful as the church is that we don't move straight onto how things need to be better. And we've got to spend some time in repentance and mourning for all the ways that we have ruined lives, both in terms of sexual violence and in terms of male domination of women, but also in terms of our colonial heritage and the way that we have destroyed nations. And so we have a lot of, you know, we need at least like a decade of repentance. And I think it's probably a bit of a high goal, but, you know, that we could get Christians to, you know, mourn and really recognise the horror of what we've done. But I suppose that's one of the things that I hope that we can start to challenge some of that stuff. And so, yeah, so I guess it's working out where is God in this and where does God want me in all this, and continuing to try and move forward with that.
This is Premier Christian Radio.